I'm going to try to save you all, some time and some frustration in a few days. It's going to cost you the next 5 or 10 minutes. That's the upfront cost. So on Monday, when we celebrate the life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I expect that you'll see two kinds of social media posts and think pieces from your feeds. You're going to see people quote him saying, "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews. You're talking anti-Semitism." And you're going to see others either attempting to discredit that quote and in other ways take quotes from Dr. King to support whatever existing narratives they hold, and my guess this year is especially regarding Israel and Palestine. American-Israeli historian Martin Kramer, he's now at Tel Aviv University, he tracked down the original context of this anti-Zionist, anti-Semitism quote a few years ago after it became the subject of a public dispute. The short version of the story, the longer version is more dramatic. We'll save that one for another time. But the short version is that he found that Dr. King did say, "When people criticize Zionists, they mean Jews." But he said it behind closed doors during a small private dinner in Cambridge, Massachusetts in October 1967. One of the attendees at that dinner attributed that quote to Dr. King in an article the following year after Dr. King had already died. So while he did say this phrase, he said it behind closed doors, and he may have said it in direct response to a recent anti-Semitic article published by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, an organization with whom Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had their differences, especially later on into the 60s. In reality, Dr. King had a much more complex relationship to the Arab-Israeli conflict. He repeatedly supported Israel's right to exist and also visited the Arab world and sympathized with their conditions. In Chicago, in September 1967, he said that imposed poverty in the Middle East threatens the prospect of peace. He challenged leadership on all sides of the conflict to pursue peace and root out any private interests. Dr. King understood the complicated nature of the Arab-Israeli conflict and was very careful to not take too strong of a position in favor of one side or another. Any attempt to do so now, with his words, nearly 56 years after his death, is at best inaccurate. There is simply no way to know how exactly Dr. King would respond to the last 55 years of history in Israel or the violence and despair in Israel and Gaza since October 7th. We can, however, let the qualities of his moral leadership guide us in this ongoing and deeply difficult moment. Qualities of moral leadership that earned Dr. King the status of our modern prophet. Qualities that he emulated from the Hebrew tradition, beginning with Moses in this week's Torah portion. The similarities between our biblical and modern prophets, Moses and Dr. King, are abundant, from each of their humble and insecure beginnings through their respective deaths before each of their life's work was complete. In Dr. King's last speech, he even alluded to Moses' final speech in the book of Deuteronomy. Rather than give you the full comparison, which would take a bit longer than the time we have now, I'll focus on three qualities of moral leadership that both Dr. King and Moses exemplified. They were fierce advocates for their people. They utilized their partnerships, and they courageously confronted the powerful people and structures responsible for their oppression. While the prophetic message of freedom and justice is relevant everywhere, Moses and Dr. King began with their own In the beginning of the book of Exodus, Moses, who at that point had been raised with Egyptian privileges, intervened when an Egyptian was beating a Hebrew slave. He intervened quite harshly, and in that moment prioritized the well-being and dignity of his Hebrew sibling over that of the Egyptian taskmaster. And from that point on, he answered the call of leadership for his people, from the exodus out of Egypt to the Ten Commandments, to leading them all around the desert, even defending them from God at different points. Moses was for his people. And Dr. King's most significant work was his ceaseless organizing, speaking, and advocacy against racist laws that led to the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, both of which outlawed the legal racial discrimination that oppressed black people in areas of segregation, voting, housing, employment, education, and more. Dr. King cared about other causes as well. He opposed the Vietnam War, he led a movement against poverty, but he started with his own people, working against anti-black racism. For both Moses and Dr. King, when faced with the difficult moral leadership decision of where to direct their efforts, whose oppression sat heaviest on their hearts, and who to lead, they chose their own people. Each of them, however, weren't exclusive nationalists by any means. Moses married a Midianite woman named Zipporah, and Dr. King worked closely with leaders from other backgrounds. And further, their ability to utilize partnerships within and beyond their communities was essential to their leadership. In another few chapters, Moses takes the organizational advice of his father-in-law, Yitro, a Midianite priest, and in this week's Torah portion, takes his brother Aaron with him to confront Pharaoh because his brother is the stronger speaker. And most significantly, everything Moses does is in partnership with God. He never tries to do it alone. There are few, if any, stronger speakers. Speaking of Aaron, speaking on Moses' behalf, there are few, if any, stronger speakers than Dr. King. But he also utilized the strength and the support of the people and organizations around him to further his mission. In the latest biography of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., it's called King, A Life by Jonathan Eig. It was published last year after 35 years, 35-year gap before the last biography on Dr. King. His biographer makes the point that he makes it plain that King was not acting in a vacuum. And he traces the work of organizations like the NAACP, CORE, and SNCC, and of men like Thurgood Marshall, John Lewis, Julian Bond, and Ralph Abernathy. While Jonathan Eig also points out that Dr. King was too radical for some and too conservative for others, it was a unique leadership gift of his to remain in the conversation. These two great leaders recognized that they could not do it alone. Collaborating, utilizing partnerships, and seeking support were necessary to each of their legacies. Lastly, and perhaps most famously, Moses and Dr. King were icons of courageous confrontation. They spoke truth to power. What's Moses most known for saying? Said a little bit earlier in the service. Let my people go. Shlach et ami. And who does he say it to? Says it to Pharaoh, says it to the king of the land. Again and again, Moses confronted Pharaoh with these powerful words, let my people go. Words that unfortunately resonate even stronger right now with captives still in Gaza. One could say that nearly all of Dr. King's speeches were both to his immediate audience and to the power structure he intended to lobby. He addressed I Have a Dream to the 250,000 people in the audience, and it was in Washington, D.C., at the National Mall, so the members of the presidential cabinet and Congress would also hear his message loudly and clearly. A year and a half later, in a speech called Our God is Marching On, he gave that one in Selma, Alabama. That's the speech when he said the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends towards justice. He made it clear that the nation was still far from racial equality, even in the wake of the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts. In both of these speeches and his others, he is speaking directly to his audience and his allies, while at the same time confronting those in power about the subjects of his speeches and inspiring his listeners to do the same. Once again, Moses and Dr. King share an essential quality of moral leadership. They courageously confront the people who have the power to change their conditions. There is no question that Moses and Dr. King share qualities, and they particularly share qualities of moral leadership. They went to bat for their people, they utilized partners and collaborators, and they spoke truth to power. These are qualities that we sorely need today in many areas of the world, but especially in Israel and Gaza on the 98th day of war, both on the level of governments and on the level of individuals with deep ties to Israel, advocating for our people, working together, and courageous confrontation are essential and accurate lessons of moral leadership from Moses and Dr. King. On Monday, when we celebrate Dr. King further, know that applying the principles of his leadership is far more honorable to his blessed memory than a social media post that you might come across taking a quote of his out of context. And know that it is absolutely vital that both we and our leaders, especially in Israel and Palestine, follow in these sacred footsteps this weekend and beyond. Shabbat Shalom.